Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our Bible Ponder for this week. This is the first kind of full-fledged video in our series on kind of big themes of the Bible that help us put the stories that we read from the Bible kind of in proper perspective so that as we read something, we can see how these themes weave and dance together to make a kind of wider story and something that still impacts us today. So the kind of theme that we're talking about today, it's a dual theme that I'm calling Exile and Exodus. And these two themes I've grouped together because they really do go hand in hand. And you will have heard us in church talk about these from the pulpit at various times and how they play out kind of again and again throughout the Bible. And they're two of kind of the most important ideas that come out of all of the Bible and still influence a lot of how we see ourselves as part of this great tradition. So obviously with the Exodus, that is a huge part of Judaism and Christianity. The Exodus being the beginning of the Passover meal, which is still celebrated year after year, and Passover meal, which then is taken by Jesus and becomes our communion, our Eucharist. And so the Exodus in that sense is still just right on face, a massive part of who we are as Christians today. But it's kind of even bigger than that. So there are historical bits to these, but in a way we need to understand why these historical accounts as they're presented are where they are and are what they are. So first, I think one of the things that we need to remember as we read the Old Testament as it's been compiled for us is that in some ways they present not just history, unbiased, objective history, but they present to us a way of understanding history and our current circumstances. And so they ascribe kind of meaning to historical things in order to help us understand who we are now. So for the people of Israel to read Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers, for them it's history, but it's history telling them who they are now. So it's not just information, it's also about now. The other way is seeing how we relate to God. So particularly with Exile and Exodus, these themes are really important because they tell us a lot about who we are in relation to God and where we are kind of along this kind of continuum. So despite what the world looks like, we can look to these themes of Exile and Exodus and look to a trust in God to see how God acts. So there are a few major things that we'll see kind of Exile and Exodus replay through the whole Bible, and then we'll talk about a couple, and then we'll read a big chapter and get to that at the end. So the first kind of exile that happens ever is the Garden of Eden, when Adam and Eve take the fruit from the serpent and eat it and are deemed to have sinned and therefore violated what God had created in Eden. They are exiled from the garden. So that is the very first exile, a kind of precursor to the exiles that happen. And then you get the exile in Egypt after Abraham comes up and is chosen by God and receives God's promises, and his descendants move down, and then eventually through famine and whatever reason they move to Egypt and then are enslaved. And so that kind of becomes, in a sense, that sort of second exile, which then has the Exodus, where God's people are rescued and taken through the wilderness, which is another theme that we'll get to next week, and taken into the promised land. And throughout the Bible, over and over, especially in the Old Testament, you hear the refrain, "I am the God of your forefathers who brought you out of Egypt." So that Exodus, the return from exile in that story, plays a massive role in understanding who the people of Israel are in relation to God. And that's how that plays out in that very first and main Exodus. But then it sort of happens again and again as God rescues his people. The people fall out of favor throughout the history of these little mini episodes of falling out of favor and rescue, his sort of exile and Exodus played out in miniature. And then you have the great big exile, which is first with Assyria and the northern kingdoms, and then finally through the nation of Babylon and Nebuchadnezzar conquering all of Judea and the southern kingdoms as well, sacking Jerusalem, destroying the temple, doing all of that, and literally taking the majority of the people of Israel away from their homeland. And so then you have this great exile where most of the Jews do not live in Jerusalem and Israel. They are exiled from the land, and they understand this both physically but also primarily a spiritual exile. And you have a whole lot of the prophets, the books of the prophets written during this time. And you have things like visions from Ezekiel, where Ezekiel literally, well, in Ezekiel's vision, he literally sees the Spirit of God leaving the temple, which is both a condemnation of the people of Israel, but also almost a reprieve to say that God is not destroyed. Although the temple is destroyed, Jerusalem is destroyed, our promised land is occupied and taken over, and we're removed from the land, God is still existing. God has not been destroyed. God has just abandoned the temple. So kind of twinned with this exile, that you've fallen out of favor, you've sinned, and therefore there is this punishment, this exile. There is the hope of Exodus, the hope that God has not abandoned you, and the hope then that God will come and take you out of your exile and lead you back into a promised land, just like God led the Israelites out of Egypt. There, that refrain comes back again. So the way they understood that then spiritually, as the exile being about God, then when the majority of the people then return from Babylon and are living in Israel, they don't see the exile as having ended, because God has not returned favor. So even though they're living back in the promised land, Rome still reigns. So you had Babylon, and then Persia, and then Alexander the Great, and the Greek Empire, and then Rome. So they're still conquered people. So they still see the exile as continuing, even though they're back living in the land. So then enter Jesus. And in the Gospels, the way that Jesus is presented is almost a new Exodus. And so Jesus fits a lot of the types for the Exodus story. He is both a kind of new Israel and a new Moses. And he's a new Moses, especially you see this in Matthew's Gospel. Matthew has Jesus giving 5 big discourses, as we call them. If you have a red letter edition Bible with the words of Jesus in red ink, and you flip through Matthew, you'll find kind of 5 big sections of red text. And those are kind of meant by the Gospel of Matthew to echo the 5 books of the law, the Torah. And many of the aspects of the story of Jesus' birth kind of echo Moses' birth. And even then, echoing the story of Israel, Jesus is taken as a baby and escapes to Egypt, when Herod is trying to kill him. So in the story of Moses, Pharaoh has issued a decree for all of the sons of the people of Israel to be killed because they're becoming too numerous. And so Moses is rescued and put in a basket, sent down the river, and Herod decrees that all the boys be killed for fear of this new king. And Jesus is then rescued. And so just as the people of Israel went into Egypt at first to be rescued and then came back into Israel, Jesus goes into Egypt and comes back. In the beginning of his ministry, he is baptized in the Jordan River by John the Baptist. And the nation of Israel enters the promised land by crossing the Jordan River. So even in the narrative bits of the story, the kind of parts that we would normally just brush over as geography or whatever, they play an important role as well in the story, because they're echoing this pattern of exile and Exodus. So then you also have Jesus choosing 12 disciples, kind of marking the 12 tribes of Israel. In the genealogies, he's in the line of King David and going all the way back to Abraham. But what is sort of different now when we get to Jesus is the pattern is coming to an end. So Jesus is going to be this last Exodus to end the exile for good and to repair our relationship to God. Because remember, this isn't just about bits of the story or narrative or history. It's also about how we relate to God. And that's where it gets to us as people. So Jesus comes and brings this new exodus and repairs our relationship with God. And that leads us to the text I'm going to read, a pretty lengthy text of just all of the chapter 18 of the book of Revelation. And in this chapter, part of John's vision is that he sees these different beasts and how they interact with the one seated on the throne and the Lamb, and how all of this plays out. And so a big key that this is exile talk, and this pattern repeated, is clearly that one of these beasts is named Babylon. And so she is both described as a woman, but also a city. And so what we'll see here when John is talking about the fall of Babylon, and maybe again spiritually the sort of end of exile, is you'll see talk that can relate to us. So we'll go ahead and read Revelation 18, and I'll pull out a couple of things here and there to talk about how Babylon isn't just a historical nation of Babylon, but is a sort of spiritual reality that has repeated itself and maybe still exists for us today. So let's read Revelation 18. After this, I saw another angel coming down from heaven, having great authority, and the earth was made bright with his splendor. He called out with a mighty voice, "Fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great. It has become a dwelling place of demons, a haunt of every foul spirit, a haunt of every foul bird, a haunt of every foul and hateful beast. For the nations have drunk of the wine of the wrath of her fornication, and the kings of the earth have committed fornication with her, and the merchants of the earth have grown rich from the power of her luxury." Then I heard another voice from heaven saying, "Come out of her, my people, so that you do not take part in her sins, and so that you do not share in her plagues, for her sins are heaped high as heaven, and God has remembered her iniquities. Render to her as she herself has rendered, and repay her double for her deeds. Mix a double draught for her in the cup she mixed. As she glorified herself and lived luxuriously, so give her a like measure of torment and grief. Since in her heart she says, I rule as a queen. I am no widow, and I will never see grief. Therefore her plagues will come in a single day, pestilence and mourning and famine, and she will be burned with fire, for mighty is the Lord God who judges her. And the kings of the earth who committed fornication and lived in luxury with her will weep and wail over her when they see the smoke of her burning. They will stand far off in fear of her torment and say, Alas, alas, the great city, Babylon, the mighty city, for in 1 hour your judgment has come. And the merchants of the earth weep and mourn for her, since no one buys their cargo anymore. Cargo of gold, silver, jewels, and pearls, fine linen, purple, silk, and scarlet, all kinds of scented wood and articles of ivory, all articles of costly wood, bronze, iron, and marble, cinnamon, spice, incense, myrrh, frankincense, wine, olive oil, choice flour and wheat, cattle and sheep, horses and chariots, slaves and human lives. The fruit for which your soul longed has gone from you, and all your dainties and your splendor are lost to you, never to be found again. The merchants of these wares who gained wealth from her will stand far off in fear of her torment, weeping and mourning aloud. Alas, alas, the great city, clothed in fine linen, in purple and scarlet, adorned with gold, with jewels, and with pearls. For in 1 hour all this wealth has been laid waste. All the shipmasters and seafarers, sailors, and all those whose trade is on the sea stood far off and cried out as they saw the smoke of her burning. What city was like the great city? And they threw dust on their heads as they wept and mourned, crying out, Alas, alas, the great city, where all who had ships at sea grew rich by her wealth, for in 1 hour she has been laid waste. Rejoice over her, O heaven, you saints and apostles and prophets, for God has given judgment for you against her. Then a mighty angel took up a stone like a great millstone and threw it into the sea, saying, With such violence Babylon, the great city, will be thrown down and will be found no more. And the sound of harpists and minstrels and of flutists and trumpeters will be heard in you no more. And an artisan of any trade will be found in you no more. And the sound of the millstone will be heard in you no more. And the light of a lamp will shine in you no more. And the voice of bridegroom and bride will be heard in you no more. For your merchants were the magnates of the earth, and all nations were deceived by your sorcery. And in you is found the blood of prophets and of saints, and of all who have been slaughtered on earth. So what we see in this long chapter in the fall of Babylon is this repeated idea that exile is coming to an end, almost through an exodus. You have the phrase, "Come out of her, my people," a phrase really echoing the Exodus and God calling Israel up out of Egypt. And you have the talk of plagues and of pestilence, again, that kind of echoing that Exodus. But what we have here then that relates to us is, as I talked about, history being used and repeated, not just to see what happened as in facts, but to tell us who we are and how we relate to God. So the fall of Babylon for John in Revelation is likely for him, in his circumstance, relating a lot to Rome, the nation of Rome, the city of Rome. Rome was referred to as the great city, and of course it was rich, and all nations are a part of the Roman Empire, for them in their world, and they grow rich. And the massive point that you see here repeated over and over again that is shown as part and parcel of this great city of Babylon is its materialism, its thoughtless, destructive materialism. Its focus on wealth and trading, not just goods, but even human lives. And so for John, in his context, in the late first century, he's seeing this end of exile and this new exodus through Christ as the fall of likely Rome, but not just Rome. Rome is only a placeholder. These ideas of materialism and destructive wealth creation and hoarding and the trading of goods and human lives exist outside of a specific city. At the time John writes this, Babylon is long gone from the earth. So Babylon was a placeholder. Rome is a placeholder. So the question then is, who in our modern world is Babylon? I can let you connect the dots of some of this wealth and materialism and thoughtless accumulation of things and trading, where when the city falls, who mourns but the merchants, the magnates, the people who are growing fat and wealthy off of this great city. And so as we see then the end of exile that we look forward to, this new exodus where God comes to rescue us, where we're looking to how we relate to God, we're looking for rescue from the God who brought God's people out of Egypt and rescued them and will rescue us. Jesus came as this new Israel to reenact this and to end the exile, but it's still being ended. It's that now and not yet, that Jesus has died for us, but we are still waiting for the ultimate conclusion of that. So for John in Revelation, we're only in chapter 18. In a couple of chapters, John gets to the end where Jesus comes again and the world is remade and there's a new city, a holy city, Jerusalem, that stands, and it's open, its gates are wide open and free, and everyone lives in peace and they live with God in the city. And that is the ultimate end of exile that we hope for, when the whole world is recreated. And then in this new city, in this new world, it's almost a new Eden, going all the way back to that first exile, where the end of exile is not just the end of the Babylonian captivity or the end of rule by Rome, but it's healing that very first exile from the Garden of Eden. And that's what Jesus' death accomplished. And that's what we await the full conclusion of when we wait for God to come and rescue us. So that is very, very in brief, exile and Exodus is a major theme of the Bible. Thank you for listening in, for watching this. Next week, we'll be looking at the theme of wilderness and how the idea of wilderness in the Bible gives us clues and teaches us more about what's going on in the story, and again, how we relate to God. So thanks for watching. I hope to catch you next week. Bye-bye.